Space is the final frontier, beautiful, infinite, and completely unforgiving. Up there, survival depends on flawless precision, because a single error, a hidden defect, or one wrong calculation can end everything in seconds. These aren't just accidents, they are final moments etched into history, where courage met sudden catastrophe. From spacecraft that became sealed tombs to missions that never made it back through Earth's atmosphere, these stories expose the brutal reality of space travel. Here are 5 of the most terrifying space deaths ever recorded. January 27, 1967 was supposed to be another routine step toward the moon. NASA's Apollo 1 mission was preparing for what should have been a simple ground test, a rehearsal for history. The goal was enormous, landing a man on the moon. And inside the command module sat 3 of America's finest. Air Force Colonel Virgil Gus Grissom, a veteran astronaut and the second American to ever fly in space. Air Force Colonel Edward H. White II, the first American to walk in space, a national hero. And Navy Lieutenant Commander Roger B. Chaffee, young, brilliant, and on the brink of his very first spaceflight. They were confident, ready. No one inside that capsule believed this would be the day they died. The test began calmly at Cape Kennedy's Launch Complex 34. The astronauts were sealed inside the command module, running through a simulated countdown for a launch scheduled just weeks away. The cabin was pressurized with pure oxygen, standard procedure at the time. Everything seemed normal, but beneath the seats, hidden behind panels and wiring, danger was quietly building. At 6:31 p.m., just 10 minutes before the simulated liftoff, the calm shattered. A voice cracked over the radio. "Fire! I smell fire." Seconds later, flames exploded inside the capsule. In an environment filled with pure oxygen, the fire didn't creep, it roared. It raced across the cabin walls, igniting materials never meant to burn. The temperature skyrocketed. Thick, toxic smoke filled the module almost instantly. Outside, stunned engineers watched in horror as smoke poured from the spacecraft. Inside the capsule, the astronauts fought to escape, but the hatch opened inward, designed that way to prevent accidental opening in space. Under normal conditions, it took over 90 seconds to open. With pressure rapidly building inside the capsule and fire consuming everything, it became impossible. The heat warped metal. The pressure vessel ruptured. Toxic gases flooded the cabin. Within minutes, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were overcome by smoke and suffocation before help could reach them. Rescue crews desperately worked to open the hatch, but it took 5 agonizing minutes. 5 minutes too late. When the doors finally came open, the silence inside told the story. The Apollo program had suffered its first fatalities not in space, not during launch, but on the ground, during what was supposed to be a non-hazardous test. The nation was shaken. In the middle of the Cold War and the race to the moon, America was forced to confront the brutal cost of exploration. President Lyndon B. Johnson mourned publicly, calling them 3 valiant young men who gave their lives in the service of their nation. Leaders across the country, and even from the Soviet Union, expressed respect for the fallen astronauts. The loss cut deep. NASA's investigation revealed a terrifying chain of failures. A likely electrical spark from damaged wiring beneath Grissom's seat. A cabin filled with highly flammable pure oxygen at high pressure. Materials inside the spacecraft that ignited instantly. And most fatally, a hatch design that trapped the crew when they needed escape the most. It wasn't one mistake. It was many, stacked together, waiting for the worst possible moment. Apollo 1 changed everything. NASA tore the spacecraft apart literally and figuratively. The hatch was redesigned to open outward in seconds. Flammable materials were removed. Wiring was rebuilt. Fire-resistant suits were developed. A new safety oversight was put in place to ensure nothing like this could ever happen again. Less than 3 years later, Apollo 11 landed on the moon. But that moment when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface carried the weight of 3 men who never made it there. Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee. Their mission ended in flames, but their sacrifice reshaped spaceflight forever. In March of 1961, while the world was holding its breath for the first human spaceflight, a young Soviet cosmonaut was quietly fighting for his life behind sealed steel walls in Moscow. His name was Valentin Bondarenko. He was only 24 years old and a member of the Soviet Union's first cosmonaut group. He was never meant to die that day. In fact, he wasn't even supposed to be remembered. Bondarenko had grown up in wartime hardship in Kharkiv, watching his father leave to fight on the Eastern Front while dreaming of flight himself. Aviation heroes filled his imagination, and by his late teens he was already chasing the sky through military flight schools. By the time Sputnik shocked the world in 1957, Bondarenko was a trained fighter pilot. 2 years later, he was promoted, married, became a father, and in 1960, he was selected for what would have been the greatest honor of his life, training to become a cosmonaut. Those who trained alongside him remembered him as gentle and cheerful. In April 1960, he joined the first group of 20 cosmonauts preparing for the Vostok missions. History was accelerating, and Bondarenko was right there, ready to be part of it. On March the 23rd, 1961, Bondarenko was nearing the end of a brutal 15-day endurance test inside a low-pressure altitude chamber at Moscow's Institute of Biomedical Problems. The atmosphere inside the chamber was dangerously rich in oxygen. He had already completed 10 days alone in isolation, monitored constantly, pushing his body to its limits. That day, the test was nearly over. He removed medical sensors from his skin and cleaned himself with an alcohol-soaked cotton ball. Then, in a moment that would cost him everything, he dropped it. The cotton ball landed on an electric hot plate he had been using to heat water for tea. In a normal room, it might have smoldered. Inside that oxygen-filled chamber, it exploded into flames. Fire raced across the confined space instantly. Bondarenko tried to beat it out with his sleeve, but his wool clothing caught fire too. The oxygen-rich air turned the chamber into a furnace. Outside, doctors watched in horror as alarms sounded. They rushed to the chamber, but they couldn't open it. The pressure difference made the door impossible to release quickly. For nearly 30 minutes, Bondarenko burned inside that sealed capsule, trapped, breathing fire and smoke, as his clothes disintegrated around him. By the time the chamber was finally opened, almost all the oxygen inside had been consumed. Bondarenko was alive, but barely. He was rushed to the hospital with third-degree burns covering most of his body. A surgeon later recalled that the only veins he could find to start an IV were on the soles of Bondarenko's feet, protected only because his boots hadn't burned through. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, preparing for his own historic flight, reportedly sat at his bedside for hours. 16 hours after the fire, Valentin Bondarenko died of shock. He died just 3 weeks before Gagarin became the first human in space, and then he vanished. The Soviet government erased Bondarenko from history. His death was never announced. His name was removed from photographs. His face was literally airbrushed out of official images. Rumors spread about missing cosmonauts and failed launches, but no one was told the truth. For nearly 2 decades, Valentin Bondarenko officially never existed. Only in 1980 did the world finally learn how he died. By then, his tragedy had already echoed across history. His death, caused by fire in a sealed, oxygen-rich environment, mirrored what would later happen to the Apollo 1 crew in 1967. Yet Bondarenko's name was missing even from the memorial plaque left on the moon because his sacrifice was still classified when it was made.
The 4-man crew of Project Gemini made its way from Ellington Air Force Base, Texas, to its destination at Lambert Field in St. Louis, Missouri. The weather was not expected to change throughout the day.
On February 28, 1966, 2 astronauts were not preparing for launch, not strapping into a rocket, and not facing the vacuum of space. They were doing something far more ordinary and just as deadly. Elliot C. and Charles Bassett, the prime crew of NASA's Gemini 9 mission, climbed into a sleek T-38 jet trainer for what should have been a routine flight. In a matter of minutes, both men would be dead. C and Bassett were on their way from Houston to St. Louis for 2 weeks of simulator training at McDonnell Aircraft, where their Gemini capsule was being assembled. It was a trip they had made before. Nothing about the mission felt extraordinary. C, A calm and methodical pilot took the controls. Bassett sat behind him. A second T-38 followed closely behind, carrying their backup crew Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan. Together, they lifted off from Ellington Air Force Base just after sunrise. As they approached Lambert Field in St. Louis, the weather turned hostile. Rain mixed with snow. Fog hung low. Clouds pressed down close to the ground, forcing the pilots to rely on instruments. When the two jets finally broke through the cloud layer, both crews realized they had overshot the runway. It was a moment every pilot dreads, a split-second decision point where instinct and judgment matter more than anything else. Stafford, in the trailing jet, lost sight of C's aircraft in the clouds and did what training demanded. He aborted the landing and climbed back into the overcast for another attempt. C, however, chose a different path, believing he still had visual contact with the airfield. He attempted a circling approach, bringing the aircraft around manually to line up for landing. But the visibility was worse than it appeared. Flying low, with landing gear down and flaps fully extended, the jet began to sink too quickly and drift too far left of the runway. C realized it too late. He throttled up, engaged the afterburner, and pulled hard to the right in a desperate attempt to recover. Seconds later, at 8:58 a.m., the T-38 slammed into the roof of a McDonnell aircraft building. The impact was catastrophic. The jet sheared off its wing, tore through the structure, and cartwheeled into a parking lot beyond the building. Elliot C. was thrown from the cockpit, still strapped to his ejection seat, his parachute partially deployed but useless. Charles Bassett was killed instantly, his body torn apart by the force of the crash. Inside the building, workers scrambled as debris rained down, fires ignited, and sprinklers burst. 17 people were injured. The Gemini spacecraft the astronauts were meant to fly sat just hundreds of feet away, untouched. Up in the clouds, Stafford and Cernan had no idea what had happened. Air traffic controllers were confused. Two jets had attempted different abort maneuvers, and for long moments no one knew which aircraft had gone down or who had been inside it. Stafford and Cernan were eventually cleared to land, but they weren't told the truth until their wheels were already on the ground. Their crewmates, friends they had trained with, laughed with, and trusted were gone. NASA's investigation came swiftly. Headed by Alan Shepard, the review board examined every possibility: mechanical failure, medical issues, air traffic control, weather. In the end, the verdict was blunt pilot error. The report stated that Elliot C. had lost visual reference during the landing attempt. The conclusion sparked debate, quiet anger, and lasting controversy. Some criticized C. harshly. Others, including Neil Armstrong, defended him. But the result was final. 2 astronauts were dead, not because of space, but because the margin for error in this profession is thin, even on Earth. The program moved on. Gemini 9 was reassigned. Stafford and Cernan took over the mission. Crew rotations shifted changes that would eventually place Buzz Aldrin on Apollo 11, walking on the Moon 3 years later. History advanced, as it always does.
The Alcatara VLS accident 2003. The Alcatara Launch Center, Maranhão, Brazil. Just 3 days before liftoff, technicians and engineers are making final preparations for a landmark moment in Brazilian space history.
On the afternoon of August 22, 2003, the Alcântara Launch Center in northern Brazil was alive with quiet focus. Engineers and technicians moved through their final checks, walking beneath a towering rocket that represented decades of ambition and national pride. The VLS-1 Visio 3 wasn't scheduled to launch for another 3 days. There was no countdown, no alarms, no reason for anyone on that platform to believe they were standing in the shadow of death. Then, at 1:26 p.m., everything changed. Without warning, one of the rocket's first stage boosters ignited while the vehicle was still bolted to the launch pad. There was no escape window, no time to react. In seconds, the launch tower was swallowed by fire and pressure hotter than 3,000 degrees Celsius. The blast ripped through the structure. Survivors later described hearing the terrifying roar of a booster firing, followed by violent explosions, bangs so loud they felt like the sky itself was tearing apart. 21 people were on the platform when it happened, Within 8 seconds, thick smoke and superheated gases engulfed the entire tower. The rocket disintegrated where it stood. For nearly 5 minutes, the mobile integration tower remained upright, burning like a funeral pyre before collapsing into ruins. There was nothing anyone could do. Those closest to the rocket were killed instantly. Brazil had lost some of its brightest minds in a single, brutal moment. Engineers, technicians, civilians who had dedicated their lives to building a future in space were gone before the mission even began. Families waited for news that would never bring comfort. The base reopened to the press the next day, but the damage was far deeper than twisted metal and ash. The explosion didn't just kill 21 people, it nearly killed Brazil's space program. Investigations would later reveal that the cause was an unplanned ignition of a first-stage booster. Why it happened was harder to explain. Russian specialists were brought in. Theories ranged from electrostatic discharge to design flaws in the booster housing. Sabotage was suspected, whispered, and ultimately dismissed. The final conclusion pointed to a deadly combination of vulnerability and oversight. An ignition triggered where no ignition should have been possible. The timing made the tragedy even more surreal. As the rocket exploded, the head of Brazil's space agency was speaking to reporters about a new international agreement involving the very same launch center. He learned of the disaster from journalists mid-conference. The contrast between optimism and catastrophe could not have been more cruel. In the years that followed, families fought for answers and compensation. Memorial services were held, laws were passed, towers were rebuilt at enormous cost. But the momentum was gone. The VLS program, once seen as Brazil's gateway to space independence, limped forward before being quietly shut down. A nearly completed rocket, VLS-1 V04, was abandoned, never to fly. On the morning of October 31, 2014, the Mojave Desert stretched endlessly under a pale California sky. The experimental suborbital spaceplane, VSS Enterprise, part of Virgin Galactic's ambitious Spaceship Two program, sat poised for its next test flight, a flight meant to push the boundaries of commercial space travel. Inside the cockpit were pilot Peter Siebold and co-pilot Michael Alsbury, two highly trained astronauts ready to take humanity a step closer to space tourism. Everything seemed routine, a carefully choreographed dance of engineering, preparation, and human skill. Moments after being released from its White Knight II carrier, Enterprise's hybrid rocket engine ignited perfectly, propelling the plane into the thin atmosphere above the desert. But just 11 seconds into powered flight, the impossible happened. Witnesses on the ground saw the spacecraft twist violently, then break apart in midair. Pieces of the craft scattered across a 35-mile-long debris field. The roar of destruction echoed through the desert as the dream of space turned instantly into a nightmare. Michael Alsbury was killed instantly, trapped in the chaos of a machine built to conquer the sky. Peter Siebold, strapped into the cockpit, experienced the unthinkable. The aircraft around him disintegrated while he remained alive, plummeting toward Earth from roughly 50,000 feet. Strapped in, he fought to free himself, finally deploying his parachute and surviving against all odds, though badly injured. The atmosphere at that altitude was nearly void of oxygen, making his survival nothing short of miraculous. Investigators would later reveal that the disaster was triggered by the premature unlocking of the feathering system, a critical air-braking mechanism designed for re-entry. In theory, it was supposed to deploy at supersonic speeds, under carefully controlled conditions. On that fateful day, stress, vibration, and acceleration may have contributed to Alsbury unlocking the system too early, sending the vehicle into a deadly spiral. The design itself had no fail-safes to prevent such human error, an oversight that would cost a life. The crash sent shockwaves far beyond the Mojave Desert. Experts criticize the lack of independent oversight, inadequate pilot safeguards, and Virgin Galactic's secretive approach to testing. The company's ambitious vision collided with the brutal reality of physics, human limits, and the unforgiving nature of spaceflight. In the aftermath, engineers redesigned safety systems, implemented stricter protocols, and reaffirmed their commitment to pushing into the final frontier, but the cost of that lesson was seared into memory. For Michael Alsbury, the flight ended in tragedy. For Peter Siebold, it became a story of survival against impossible odds. And for everyone watching, the Enterprise disaster served as a stark reminder. Space is beautiful, exhilarating, and merciless. Even with the brightest minds, the best training, and the most meticulous planning, a single misstep at tens of thousands of feet can turn ambition into catastrophe in the blink of an eye.